Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to what scientists now call the worst year to be alive in human history, the year 536 AD. Imagine waking up tomorrow and the sun just doesn't come up. Not cloudy, not dim, just gone. For 18 months. You'd probably think it's the apocalypse, and honestly, you wouldn't be wrong. This isn't some Hollywood disaster movie. This actually happened, and it nearly wiped out our entire species. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Fair warning though, after tonight, you'll never complain about a cloudy day again. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 536 AD, and you're about to experience what historians now call the worst year to be alive in all of human history. Good news, you're still breathing. Bad news, you might start questioning whether that's actually a good thing. You rub your eyes and sit up on your straw mattress. Think of it as the medieval version of a memory foam bed, except it remembers absolutely nothing and provides the comfort level of sleeping on a pile of pine cones. Something feels wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it. The roosters should have been crowing hours ago. Your neighbors should be starting their daily routine of arguing about whose goat ate whose cabbage. But there's an eerie silence hanging in the air like a bad omen. You stumble to your window, basically a hole in the wall with a piece of animal hide stretched across it, and push it aside. What you see makes absolutely no sense. It should be mid-morning, but the world outside looks like it's perpetually stuck in the 20 minutes before sunset. Not the golden, Instagram-worthy kind of twilight that makes everything look romantic. This is the sickly, yellow, brown dimness that makes you wonder if someone accidentally hit the sepia filter on reality itself. The sun is there, technically speaking, but it's this pale, ghostly disk barely visible through what looks like the world's worst case of atmospheric astigmatism. It's like someone took the sun and wrapped it in dirty cheesecloth, then decided that wasn't depressing enough and added a few more layers. You've seen brighter light coming from a dying phone flashlight. Your first thought might be that it's just a particularly cloudy day. After all, you're living in an era where weather forecasting consists of looking at your grandmother's knees and making educated guesses. But as you stand there, squinting at this apocalyptic scene, a chill runs down your spine that has nothing to do with the temperature. Though, come to think of it, it does seem unusually cold for this time of year. The air itself feels different. Thicker, like trying to breathe through a damp cloth. There's a metallic taste in your mouth that reminds you of licking coins. Except you're pretty sure you haven't been engaging in any medieval currency tasting activities lately. Everything smells vaguely of sulfur and ash, as if someone decided to barbecue something particularly unpleasant somewhere far away, and the smoke has been slowly drifting in your direction for weeks. You step outside, and the wrongness hits you like a physical force. The birds aren't singing, the usual symphony of medieval morning sounds. Cows mooing, chickens clucking, children crying. Adults complaining about literally everything has been replaced by an unsettling quiet. It's the kind of silence that makes you want to whisper, even though there's no apparent reason for it. Your neighbors are starting to emerge from their own humble dwellings, and they all have the same expression you probably have right now. The look of someone trying to solve a puzzle while simultaneously suspecting that the puzzle might be trying to kill them. Old Henrik from next door catches your eye and shrugs with the kind of exaggerated confusion that transcends language barriers. Even without words, his gesture clearly communicates. Well, this is fucked. What you don't know yet, what nobody in your time could possibly know, is that somewhere in Southeast Asia, a massive volcanic eruption has just thrown enough ash and debris into the atmosphere to block out the sun for the next 18 months. We're talking about the Krakatoa explosion of the 6th century, except imagine Krakatoa had been hitting the gym and taking performance, enhancing supplements for a few decades. The technical term for what's happening is a volcanic winter, which sounds like something that should come with hot chocolate and cozy fireplaces. Instead, it comes with global famine, plague, and the near collapse of human civilization. It's like Mother Nature decided to throw the world's worst surprise party, and everyone's invited whether they want to be or not. You notice that your breath is visible in the air, which is odd because it's supposed to be late spring. The growing season should be in full swing right now, but looking at your pathetic excuse for a vegetable garden, you can see that your crops are already looking confused and slightly offended by the sudden change in lighting conditions. The barley shoots that should be reaching toward the sun are instead huddled together like teenagers at an awkward school dance. But here's the thing that would really blow your mind if you knew it. This isn't just happening to you, or your village, or even your kingdom. Right now, as you stand there trying to figure out why the world has suddenly developed a severe case of seasonal depression, the exact same scene is playing out across the entire planet. From the Byzantine Empire to the kingdoms of China, from the tribal lands of Britain to the emerging civilizations of the Americas, every single human being on Earth is looking up at the sky and thinking some variation of, what the hell is going on? Of course, you don't have the luxury of a global perspective. All you know is that something is very, very wrong, and you have the sinking feeling that this is just the beginning. And unfortunately, your instincts are about to prove absolutely correct. This mysterious dimming of the sun is merely the opening act of a disaster so comprehensive, so devastating, that it will literally rewrite the course of human history. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders, suddenly grateful for every scrap of wool you own, and head back inside. Outside, the pale disk of the sun continues its futile attempt to penetrate the atmospheric shroud that has become its prison. You don't know it yet, but you're about to spend the next year and a half learning exactly how much human civilization depends on that bright yellow ball in the sky. And trust me, it's a lesson you'll never forget. 3 weeks have passed since that first morning when you woke up to what can only be described as the world's most depressing lighting situation, and things haven't exactly improved. If anything, you're starting to realize that what you initially hoped was just a really bad weather day is actually more like the new normal. Except normal is a word that has completely lost its meaning. You've been keeping track by carving notches into a piece of wood, because apparently you're now living in a survival situation that would make Bear Grylls weep with professional envy. 21 notches, and not once has the sun managed to burn through whatever atmospheric soup is currently serving as Earth's new sky filter. It's like someone replaced the entire atmosphere with a giant dirty fishbowl, and you're the confused fish wondering why everything looks so murky. The temperature has dropped to what you can only describe as aggressively unpleasant. You're talking about a global climate that has essentially decided to cosplay as late November, except it's supposed to be late spring. Your breath forms little clouds when you exhale, which would be charming if it weren't happening in what should be prime growing season. It's like Mother Nature looked at her thermostat and thought, you know what this planet needs. A nice, refreshing ice age. Your crops, those optimistic little green shoots that started the season with such promise, are now staging what appears to be a very slow, very dramatic death scene. The barley that should be knee-high by now is instead crouched close to the ground, like it's trying to hide from whatever cosmic horror has taken over the sky. Your vegetables have taken on the appearance of things that have given up on life, but are too polite to die quickly. The wheat situation is particularly heartbreaking. These stalks, which should be reaching toward the sun in golden waves of future bread, instead look like they're auditioning for a role in some agricultural tragedy. They're not growing so much as existing in a state of confused suspension, like students who showed up to an exam only to discover it's been cancelled indefinitely. What makes this especially terrifying is that you're beginning to understand just how much your entire existence depends on plants successfully doing their photosynthesis thing. Without adequate sunlight, photosynthesis becomes about as effective as trying to charge your phone with a potato. Technically possible in theory, but practically useless when you need actual results. And unlike the modern world, where food comes from magical places called supermarkets, your dinner options are directly tied to whatever grows in the dirt around your village. Your neighbors are starting to exhibit the kind of behavior that happens when people realize they might be witnessing the end of the world in slow motion. Old Henrik has taken to standing in his field for hours, staring at his failing crops with the intensity of someone trying to will them into growth through sheer determination. It's not working, but you have to admire his commitment to the effort. The village elder, a man so old he claims to remember when the Romans were still a thing, has started making ominous pronouncements about signs and portents. According to him, this is clearly punishment from the gods for various moral failings, though he's frustratingly vague about which specific sins have earned humanity this particular cosmic timeout. His suggestions for appeasement range from sacrificing more goats to being nicer to each other, which honestly isn't the worst advice you've ever heard. But here's what would really blow your mind if you had access to a global perspective. This isn't just your village's problem. Right now, across the entire known world, the exact same agricultural disaster is unfolding simultaneously. In the Byzantine Empire, farmers are watching their grain harvests fail. In China, rice paddies that should be green and flourishing are instead struggling to survive in the perpetual twilight. In Britain, Saxon farmers are staring at their fields with the same expression of confused despair that you're wearing right now. The scientific reality, which won't be understood for another 1,500 years, is that massive volcanic eruptions in Indonesia have launched approximately 100 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. This has created what scientists will eventually call a nuclear winter effect, except instead of being caused by atomic bombs, it's courtesy of a mountain that essentially decided to explode with the force of several thousand atomic bombs all at once. The global temperature has dropped by an average of 2.5 degrees Celsius, which might not sound like much until you realize that this is the difference between civilization and the kind of climate that makes entire societies pack up and move somewhere else. We're talking about a climate shift so dramatic that it will literally trigger mass migrations, topple empires, and rewrite the genetic makeup of entire populations. But you don't have access to global climate data or scientific explanations. All you know is that your carefully planned agricultural year has turned into an exercise in watching things die slowly. The growing season that should sustain your community through the winter is instead becoming a preview of what starvation might look like. You've started rationing your stored grain, even though it's still technically spring. The winter supplies that should have lasted until the new harvest are now being stretched to cover what's looking like an indefinitely extended period of agricultural failure. It's like trying to make a tank of gas last for a road trip when you have no idea how long the road actually is. The psychological impact is almost worse than the physical reality. Every morning you wake up hoping that today will be the day the sun breaks through, that the familiar warmth and brightness will return. And every morning you're met with the same sickly yellow twilight that has become your new reality. It's like being trapped in a perpetual state of impending sunset, except the sunset never comes and neither does the sunrise. What you can't possibly know is that this atmospheric nightmare is just the opening act of a disaster so comprehensive that historians will spend centuries trying to understand how humanity managed to survive it at all. The real horror show is just getting started. 2 months into what you're now privately calling the time when God apparently took a vacation, you've moved well beyond the initial confusion phase and settled firmly into what can only be described as existential dread with a side of practical panic. The sun has become about as reliable as a medieval weather forecast, which is to say, not at all. But here's where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean terrifying in ways that would make modern disaster movie directors weep with envy. You've started to notice that the air itself has become your enemy. Not in the obvious way that air becomes your enemy when you're drowning or suffocating, but in this subtle, insidious way that makes you feel like you're slowly being poisoned by the very act of breathing. Every breath you take feels like you're inhaling through a damp cloth that's been left in a smoky room for about 6 months. There's this constant metallic taste in your mouth that makes everything taste like you've been licking the village blacksmith's anvil, and no amount of owl, your medieval equivalent of mouthwash, seems to wash it away. It's like having permanent dragon breath, except the dragon is apparently living in your lungs and has very poor dental hygiene. Your throat has developed a persistent scratch that makes you sound like you've been gargling gravel, and everyone in the village has started sporting this charming new cough that sounds like a cross between a dying goose and someone trying to start a very reluctant cart. It's become the soundtrack of your daily life, a symphony of respiratory distress that would make a tuberculosis ward sound like a cheerful choir practice. What you don't realize is that you're essentially living inside a giant atmospheric chemistry experiment that has gone horribly wrong. The invisible enemy above your head isn't just blocking out the sun. It's actively trying to kill you with every breath you take. Those volcanic eruptions in Indonesia didn't just throw ash into the sky, they launched a cocktail of sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, and various other atmospheric party favors that would make a chemical weapons manufacturer nod in professional appreciation. The sulfur compounds are combining with water vapor to create what scientists will eventually calling it acid rain. Makes it sound like some sort of cool heavy metal album, when really it should be called ski juice that dissolves things. This is precipitation that could probably clean the rust off your farming tools, which would be handy if it weren't also dissolving your farming tools in the process. Your livestock have started exhibiting behavior that ranges from mildly concerning to absolutely what the hell. The chickens, previously reliable in their commitment to laying eggs and complaining about everything, have become moody and unpredictable. Some have stopped laying entirely, as if they've collectively decided that bringing new life into this apocalyptic scenario would be irresponsible. Others have developed a disturbing habit of just standing perfectly still for hours, staring at the perpetually dim sky like they're waiting for some cosmic punchline that never comes. The cows have taken to clustering together in the center of pastures, as far from any trees as possible, which strikes you as odd behavior until you notice that some of the older trees are starting to look decidedly unwell. The leaves that should be lush and green are instead developing brown spots and falling off in numbers that suggest the trees are having some kind of nervous breakdown. It's like watching a forest slowly commit suicide in real time. Your horse, assuming you're lucky enough to own one, which makes you basically medieval middle class, has become skittish in ways that go beyond normal horse neurosis. Horses are generally anxious creatures under the best of circumstances, but your horse is now treating every day like it expects to be personally attacked by the atmosphere itself, which, considering the circumstances, shows a level of situational awareness that's honestly impressive. The most disturbing part is that you're starting to understand that this isn't just bad weather that will eventually pass. This is something fundamentally wrong with the world itself. The very air you breathe has become contaminated with substances that your body wasn't designed to process. Every breath is a small act of poisoning yourself, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it except keep breathing and hope that whatever's happening will eventually stop. Modern science would tell you that you're dealing with atmospheric sulfur concentrations that are orders of magnitude higher than anything humans have ever been exposed to. The volcanic eruptions have essentially turned the entire planet's atmosphere into a weak acid bath, and every living thing on Earth is now marinating in it 24 hours a day. It's like someone decided to conduct a global experiment in slow-motion chemical warfare using the entire human population as test subjects. The psychological impact of breathing poison air is almost worse than the physical effects. There's something particularly horrifying about the realization that the very act of staying alive, breathing, is simultaneously killing you. It's like discovering that water is toxic or that sleeping causes brain damage. It violates the fundamental assumptions about how the world is supposed to work. Your sleep has become fitful and disturbed, partly because of the respiratory issues, but mostly because your brain has started to process the fact that you might be witnessing the slow motion end of the world. Every night you go to bed wondering if tomorrow will be the day the sun finally gives up entirely, and every morning you wake up to the same sickly yellow gloom that has become your new reality. The children in your village have started asking questions that have no good answers. Why is the sky the wrong color? Why does everything taste funny? Why are the animals acting strange? Why won't the plants grow? These are the kinds of questions that make you realize just how much of normal life depends on things that you never really thought about before, like breathable air and a sun that actually works. But the truly terrifying part is that this atmospheric nightmare is just the beginning. The poisoned air and dying plants are merely the opening act of a catastrophe so comprehensive that it will literally reshape human civilization. And you're starting to suspect that the worst is yet to come. 4 months into what you're now thinking of as the Great Dimming, you've discovered something that would make modern survivalists weep with a mixture of horror and professional respect. the human capacity for redefining the concept of audible expands dramatically when the alternative is death by starvation. Your carefully rationed grain stores, those precious winter supplies that were supposed to last until the new harvest, have dwindled to what can generously be described as optimistically insufficient. The barley crab that should have been replenished, down through the miracle of the Vesgan, have instead joined the growing list of things that no longer work the way they're supposed to. It's like playing a survival game where someone keeps changing the rules mid-game, except the game is your actual life and the penalty for losing is permanent. The village granary, once a symbol of security and forward planning, has become a monument to humanity's touching faith in the reliability of natural systems. You stare at the nearly empty storage bins and realize that your ancestors' wisdom about preparing for hard times was based on the assumption that hard times would eventually end. Nobody planned for the scenario where the sun just stops working properly for over a year. This is where your medieval education in things that are technically food, if you're desperate enough, begins in earnest. Tree bark, it turns out, is not just something that protects trees from insects. It's also something that can keep you alive when everything else has failed. The inner bark of birch, pine, and oak trees contains enough nutrients to sustain human life, though calling it sustaining is like calling a paper cut surgery. Technically accurate, but missing the full experience. The process of preparing tree bark for consumption is exactly as appetizing as it sounds. You strip the outer bark away to get to the cambium layer underneath, which has the texture of wet cardboard and the flavor profile of disappointment mixed with mild bitterness. It's like nature's version of prison food, designed to keep you alive while making you question whether life is actually worth living. But tree bark is luxury cuisine compared to some of the other items that have joined your new survival diet. Acorns, once exclusively squirrel food, have become a precious commodity that requires extensive processing to remove the tannins that make them taste like you're chewing on liquid regret. The preparation process involves grinding, soaking, rinsing, and more soaking. Basically, enough work to make you appreciate why squirrels always look so busy. Roots that you previously walked over without a second thought have suddenly become dinner prospects. Dandelion roots, burdock roots, and anything else that grows underground and doesn't immediately kill you when eaten. It's like becoming a vegetarian, except instead of choosing vegetables, the vegetables are choosing you through the process of elimination from all other food sources. The protein situation has become particularly creative. Rats, once viewed as the village nuisance, are now being eyed with the kind of calculating hunger that would make a cat proud. These rodents, who have survived countless human attempts at extermination, are now facing their greatest threat, becoming the main course. It's ironic justice on a level that would make Shakespeare weep with literary appreciation. The preparation of rat cuisine involves techniques that would never appear in any cookbook published outside of apocalypse scenarios. You skin them like tiny deer, roast them over fires made from whatever wood you can find, and try not to think too hard about their previous dining habits. The meat is surprisingly lean, which makes sense when you consider that everyone is starving, including the rats. But perhaps the most disturbing development in your culinary journey is the growing acceptance of things that would have horrified you just 4 months ago. Leather, properly prepared, can provide some nutrition, though eating your own shoes presents an interesting cost-benefit analysis. Do you preserve your footwear and starve, or eat your boots and face winter barefoot? It's the kind of decision that really puts your modern problems into perspective. The children in your village have stopped asking for second helpings, not because they've developed better manners, but because they've learned that second helpings don't exist anymore. Instead, they've become expert foragers, finding edible plants and insects with the dedication of tiny, malnourished scientists watching a 6-year-old expertly identify which beetles are safe to eat is both impressive and deeply unsettling. Insects, as it turns out, are actually quite nutritious when you can get past the psychological barrier of eating things that crunch in ways that food isn't supposed to crunch. Grasshoppers, when roasted, taste vaguely like nuts, assuming you've forgotten what actual nuts taste like. Grubs can be surprisingly meaty, though they have an unfortunate tendency to pop in your mouth like tiny, protein-filled balloons. What would really blow your mind if you had access to global information networks is that this exact scenario is playing out simultaneously across the entire planet. In China, people are stripping bark from mulberry trees and making soup from grass. In the Byzantine Empire, the wealthy are selling their jewelry for bags of millet, while the poor are competing with animals for scraps of anything edible. The social dynamics of starvation have created a new economy where the value of everything has been recalculated based on caloric content. A handful of grain is worth more than silver. A piece of dried meat commands more respect than a fine cloak. Your society has essentially reverted to the most basic form of currency, the currency of survival. The psychological impact of this dietary transformation goes beyond simple hunger. When you're forced to eat things that your brain categorizes as not food, every meal becomes a small act of breaking down the barriers between civilization and desperation. You're not just changing your diet, you're changing your fundamental relationship with the concept of what it means to be human. But here's the thing that would keep you awake at night if you weren't already kept awake by the constant gnawing of hunger. This nutritional nightmare is just the opening act. The failing food system is about to attract a co-star that will make starvation look like a minor inconvenience. Disease, as you're about to discover, loves nothing more than a population weakened by malnutrition and stress. 6 months into your extended vacation in hell, also known as the year 536 AD, you've just discovered that starvation, poisoned air, and perpetual twilight were apparently just the warm-up act. The main event has arrived, and it comes with symptoms that would make a horror movie director say, "Okay, that's a bit much, let's tone it down." It started with old Henrik next door, the same Henrik who spent the first few months staring at his dying crops with the determination of someone trying to will wheat into existence through pure stubbornness. One morning, he didn't emerge from his hovel for his usual routine of agricultural disappointment and meteorological complaints. When his wife went to check on him, she found him covered in what can only be described as nature's least attractive form of body modification: swollen black lumps that had appeared overnight like someone had stuffed walnuts under his skin. These aren't your garden variety medieval ailments that you can treat with bloodletting, prayer, and the medieval medical equivalent of. Have you tried turning it off and on again? These are buboes, lymph nodes, so swollen with infection that they look like someone inflated parts of the human body that were never meant to be inflated. They're about the size of chicken eggs, except chicken eggs don't typically turn black and leak fluids that smell like death, having a really bad day. Henrik lasted 3 days, which in plague terms makes him practically a marathon survivor. The progression was exactly as pleasant as you'd expect from a disease that historians will eventually name the Justinian plague. Though calling it Justinian's plague is like calling the atomic bomb Oppenheimer's firecracker. Technically accurate, but missing the full scope of the devastation. The disease doesn't just kill people, it kills them in ways that seem specifically designed to traumatize everyone who has to witness it. First come the lumps, then the fever that makes people delirious enough to start conversations with deceased relatives. Then there's the bleeding, from the nose, mouth, and various other orifices that aren't supposed to leak. It's like the human body has decided to stage a very dramatic and messy rebellion against the concept of staying alive. What makes this particularly terrifying in your current situation is that everyone is already weakened by months of malnutrition and breathing poison air. Your immune systems are about as robust as wet paper towels. And now you're facing a disease that could probably kill healthy people in their prime. It's like being asked to run a marathon after someone has already broken your legs and stolen your shoes. The plague spreads through your village with the efficiency of gossip and the lethality of lightning. One day you have neighbors, the next day you have houses with doors that no one opens anymore, because there's no one left inside to open them. The silence that follows each death is different from the eerie quiet that came with the dimmed sun. This is the silence of spaces that should contain human voices, but no longer do. Your village's population is being systematically edited down to a tragic short story. Families that took generations to establish are being deleted from existence in a matter of days. The blacksmith, whose father and grandfather were blacksmiths, dies without passing on his skills to a son who died 2 days before him. Centuries of accumulated knowledge and tradition are vanishing faster than food supplies, which is saying something. The bodies pile up faster than you can bury them, which creates a whole new set of problems that would make a sanitation engineer weep with professional despair. In normal times, proper burial is both a religious duty and a practical necessity for preventing the spread of disease. But these aren't normal times, and your community lacks both the manpower and the energy to give everyone the send-off they deserve. Mass graves become the practical solution, though calling them graves is generous. They're more like large holes where we put people and hope God sorts it out. The traditional funeral rites that once provided comfort and closure have been reduced to efficiency protocols that would make a factory foreman proud. It's the industrialization of death, except without the industry or any of the benefits of industrialization. What you don't know, what no one in your time could possibly know, is that you're experiencing the collision of two catastrophic events that have created the perfect storm for civilizational collapse. The volcanic winter has weakened every human on Earth, and now a pandemic is taking advantage of humanity's reduced defenses. It's like being attacked by a bear while you're already drowning. Technically two separate problems, but practically one enormous disaster. The Justinian plague, named after the Byzantine emperor who had the misfortune of ruling during this delightful period, is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same pathogen responsible for the Black Death that will terrorize Europe 8 centuries later. But this outbreak is happening to a population that's already been softened up by months of climate disaster, making it potentially even more devastating than its more famous successor. The psychological impact of watching your community disappear is almost worse than the physical threat of the disease itself. Every morning becomes a morbid roll call as you mentally check off who's still alive versus who joined the growing list of people who won't be complaining about the weather anymore. The social fabric of your village, the network of relationships, obligations, and shared experiences that made you a community rather than just a collection of individuals, is being systematically destroyed. Children who survive their parents face the particular horror of trying to understand why everyone they've ever known is disappearing. Adults who survive their children face the even worse horror of understanding exactly why this is happening and being powerless to stop it. The elderly, who in normal times would be revered for their wisdom and experience, die knowing that their accumulated knowledge will die with them because there's no one left to pass it on to. The economic system of your village has collapsed not because of financial crisis or political upheaval, but because most of the people who comprise the economy are dead. The baker, the weaver, the guy who knew how to fix cart wheels, all gone. You're not just losing people, you're losing the collective human infrastructure that made civilized life possible. But perhaps the most disturbing realization is that this plague isn't just visiting your village as some sort of cosmic coincidence. Right now, across the known world, this exact scene is playing out in communities from Constantinople to Chang'an. The same disease that's destroying your neighbors is simultaneously destroying the Byzantine Empire, toppling kingdoms and rewriting the demographic map of the entire planet. And you're starting to suspect that even if you survive this plague, the world that emerges from this catastrophe will be nothing like the world that existed before the sun went dark. 8 months into what future historians will diplomatically call a period of significant social disruption, you've discovered that civilization is a lot more fragile than anyone ever bothered to mention. It turns out that the complex social structures that keep humans from devolving into roving bands of desperate scavengers require constant maintenance, much like a garden or a marriage. Stop tending to them for a while, and everything goes to hell remarkably quickly. The village council, once the pinnacle of local democratic decision-making, has dissolved not through political revolution or philosophical disagreement, but through the simple expedient of most of the council members being dead. The remaining 2 members, yourself and the village's former tax collector, who somehow survived both plague and the general desire to strangle tax collectors, spend your meetings mostly staring at each other and wondering what exactly you're supposed to be governing. The concept of law, which once seemed as permanent as the mountains, has become about as reliable as the weather forecast. When half your community is dead and the other half is focused on the immediate problem of not joining them, legal disputes start to seem like a luxury that no one can afford. Property rights, contract enforcement, and civil procedure have been replaced by a much simpler legal system. Whoever is still breathing gets to make the decisions. The village's traditional social hierarchy has been reorganized by death in ways that would make a socialist revolutionary weep with joy, if any socialist revolutionaries existed yet, which they don't, because socialism won't be invented for another 13 centuries. The lord who once owned most of the land died 3 months ago, along with his sons, his brothers, and most of his extended family. His vast estates are now being managed by his former stable boy, who inherited the position through the time-honored medieval legal principle of everyone else is dead. Money, once the lubricant that kept the economic wheels turning, has become about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Gold and silver coins might be shiny and theoretically valuable, but you can't eat them, and they don't keep you warm at night. The economy has reverted to its most basic form, barter, except instead of trading surplus goods, you're trading necessities for slightly different necessities. A knife might get you a handful of grain, A warm cloak could be worth a week's worth of firewood. Your grandmother's jewelry box might buy you enough preserved meat to last until next week, assuming next week actually arrives. The church, once the spiritual and administrative backbone of your community, has suffered what can only be described as a crisis of both faith and personnel. The priest died 2 months ago, taking with him not only the community's spiritual guidance, but also the only person who could read and write well enough to keep records. The church building still stands, but it's become more of a communal shelter than a place of worship, filled with people who are less interested in salvation than in finding a dry place to sleep. Religious services have become increasingly creative as the survivors try to figure out how to commune with God without professional assistance. Prayers have taken on a distinctly practical tone. Less, thy will be done, and more. Please make the sun work again. The theological questions being debated are less about the nature of divine grace and more about whether God has abandoned humanity entirely or is just having a really bad decade. Trade networks that once connected your village to the wider world have collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. The merchants who used to arrive regularly with goods from distant lands have either died, been killed by bandits, or decided that traveling through a plague-ridden, climatically devastated landscape isn't worth whatever profit margin they might have been earning. Your village has become economically isolated in ways that would make North Korea look cosmopolitan. The roads themselves have become dangerous in ways that go beyond the usual medieval hazards of bandits, wolves, and the occasional dragon sighting. Desperate people do desperate things, and when entire communities are starving, the line between travelers and potential source of supplies becomes uncomfortably blurry. Highway robbery has evolved from a criminal profession into a survival strategy practiced by people who would have been pillar of the community types just 8 months ago. The technology of daily life is beginning to break down as the craftspeople who maintained it join the growing list of the deceased. The blacksmith is gone, which means no one can repair tools or make new ones. The millwright died, so the grain mill sits idle even when there's grain to mill. The master carpenter succumbed to plague, leaving buildings that need repair to slowly deteriorate. It's like watching the technological base of your civilization slowly crumble one skilled profession at a time. Knowledge itself is disappearing faster than you can preserve it. The oral traditions that passed information from generation to generation are being broken as entire family lines are extinguished. Techniques for brewing, weaving, farming, and crafting that took centuries to develop are vanishing because there's no one left to teach them and no one left to learn them. You're witnessing the wholesale deletion of human cultural memory. The children who survive this catastrophe are growing up in a world so different from the one their parents knew that they might as well be living on a different planet. They're learning skills that would be unnecessary in normal times. How to identify edible insects, how to treat plague symptoms with whatever herbs are still growing, how to defend food stores from increasingly desperate neighbors. It's like watching childhood itself being weaponized for survival. What makes this particularly heartbreaking is the realization that much of what's being lost will never be recovered. When the last person who knows how to make a particular type of tool dies, that knowledge doesn't just disappear. It becomes archaeologically extinct. Future generations will literally have to reinvent techniques and technologies that your ancestors spent centuries perfecting. The psychological impact of watching civilization unravel is almost worse than the physical hardships. Humans are social creatures who derive meaning and identity from their place in complex social structures. When those structures collapse, people don't just lose their jobs or their social status. They lose their sense of who they are and how they fit into the world. It's like collective existential crisis mixed with practical desperation. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this civilizational collapse is how quickly it's happening. 8 months ago, you lived in a society with functioning institutions, economic systems, and social networks. Now you're essentially living in a post-apocalyptic survival scenario. Except the apocalypse wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, motion catastrophe that gradually eroded everything you thought was permanent. And the truly terrifying part is that this social collapse isn't unique to your village or even your region. Across the known world, the same process is playing out as communities struggle to maintain civilization in the face of climate catastrophe and pandemic disease. The Roman Empire, once the pinnacle of organizational achievement, is discovering that even the most sophisticated governmental systems become irrelevant when there's no one left to govern. 10 months into your crash course in how quickly humans can abandon everything they once considered sacred, you've discovered that moral philosophy becomes remarkably flexible when the alternative is death. The ethical framework that once guided your decisions, those comfortable assumptions about right and wrong that worked perfectly well when everyone had enough to eat, has been replaced by a much simpler moral system. Whatever keeps you alive until tomorrow is probably justified. This morning you woke up to find that someone had broken into your neighbor's abandoned house and taken the last of their stored grain. 6 months ago, this would have been called theft, and the perpetrator would have faced justice from the village council. Today, you find yourself wondering why you didn't think of it first. The house has been empty for 3 weeks since the family died, and the grain was just sitting there, slowly rotting while people starve. It's not theft, you tell yourself. It's resource reallocation for the greater good of continued existence. The transformation of your moral compass has been so gradual that you barely noticed it happening. It started with small compromises, taking a little extra food when portions were being distributed, keeping quiet when you saw someone else doing the same thing. Then it escalated to bigger choices, deciding not to share information about a hidden food cache, looking the other way when someone found supplies that clearly belonged to someone else. Each decision seemed reasonable at the time, justified by circumstances that previous generations never had to face. You've developed what future psychologists would recognize as survival-based moral flexibility, though they'd use fancier terms like situational ethics under extreme duress. Essentially, your brain has rewired itself to prioritize immediate survival over abstract moral principles. It's like having a moral emergency brake that gets engaged when staying alive requires doing things that would have horrified your former self. The most disturbing part isn't that you're making these choices. It's how normal they've started to feel. When you see an elderly person struggling with a heavy bundle of firewood, your first thought isn't, "I should help them," but rather, "What's in that bundle and do I need it more than they do?" You've become a cost-benefit analysis machine running on the fuel of desperation, calculating every human interaction in terms of survival advantage. The children in your community have become particularly adept at these moral gymnastics, which would be impressive if it weren't so heartbreaking. They've learned to lie with the casual expertise of seasoned diplomats, telling adults whatever they need to hear to get an extra scrap of food. They've mastered the art of appearing weaker, and more pitiable than they actually are? Because weakness attracts charity, while strength attracts suspicion and resource competition. You've watched a 10-year-old girl systematically manipulate 3 different adults into giving her food by telling each of them that the others weren't sharing with her. Her performance was so convincing that you felt genuine sympathy for her plight right up until you saw her execute the same routine with a 4th adult an hour later. It's like watching a masterclass in survival psychology taught by someone who should still be playing with dolls. The social dynamics of resource sharing have created moral dilemmas that would make a philosophy professor's head explode. When there's only enough food for some people to survive, how do you decide who gets to eat and who doesn't? Do you prioritize the young because they have more years ahead of them, or the experienced adults because they have the skills needed for community survival? Do you feed the sick in hopes they'll recover? Or do you write them off as lost causes and preserve resources for the healthy? Your community has developed an unofficial triage system that would make a battlefield medic proud and a humanitarian weep. The elderly and the very sick receive smaller portions, not out of cruelty, but out of practical calculation. They're less likely to survive anyway, so why waste limited resources on lost causes? It's the kind of reasoning that makes perfect sense when you're starving and feels like a betrayal of everything human, when you have time to think about it. The breakdown of traditional family obligations has created situations that would have been unthinkable in normal times. You've seen parents choose between their own survival and their children's, making decisions that will haunt them for whatever remains of their lives. You've watched adult children abandon elderly parents who have become a drain on precious resources. These aren't monsters making these choices. They're ordinary people pushed beyond the limits of what human moral systems were designed to handle. Perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of these survival choices is that they're often disguised as acts of kindness. When someone decides to put a suffering plague victim out of their misery, it can be framed as mercy rather than resource conservation. When food gets redistributed from those who are clearly dying to those who might survive, it becomes an act of practical wisdom rather than theft from the helpless. You've become an expert at constructing justifications for behaviors that would have disgusted you a year ago. Every morally questionable choice gets wrapped in layers of rationalization so thick that you can almost convince yourself that you're still a good person making hard but necessary decisions. It's like having a full-time PR department in your head, spinning every survival strategy into something noble and justified. The relationship between survival and morality has revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature that most people never have to confront. You've discovered that the ethical principles you once thought were fundamental to your identity were actually luxury items that you could only afford when basic survival was guaranteed. Strip away food security, physical safety, and social stability, and even the most moral person becomes capable of choices that would shock their former self. What makes this particularly disturbing is the realization that these aren't aberrant behaviors exhibited by broken people. They're normal human responses to abnormal circumstances. Every person in your community is going through the same moral transformation, making the same kinds of impossible choices, constructing the same kinds of justifications. You're not experiencing individual moral failure, you're witnessing the collective reorganization of human ethics under extreme pressure. The most haunting aspect of these survival choices is knowing that some of them will stay with you forever. Even if normal times eventually return, You can't unknown the knowledge that you're capable of abandoning moral principles when survival is at stake. You can't forget the moment when you chose your own life over someone else's suffering. These experiences change who you are at a fundamental level, creating psychological scars that will never fully heal. But perhaps the most terrifying realization is that these moral compromises aren't just individual tragedies. They're reshaping the entire social fabric of human civilization. Every community that survives this catastrophe will emerge with a population that has learned to prioritize survival over traditional morality. The world that eventually recovers from this disaster will be inhabited by people who know exactly how quickly civilization can collapse and how little human moral systems matter when the alternative is death. 12 months in what you're now thinking of as the year that time forgot. You've made a discovery that hits differently than all the death, starvation, and moral compromises you've witnessed so far. There's a generation of children growing up who have no memory of what the world is supposed to look like. To them, this perpetual twilight isn't an apocalyptic catastrophe. It's just Tuesday. Little Sarah, the blacksmith's daughter who was born just 2 years before the sun decided to take an extended vacation, asked you yesterday what summer means. Not summer as a season, but summer as a concept. The idea that the world could be warm, that the sky could be blue, that plants could grow tall and green without human intervention. You tried to explain it to her, and the look of polite skepticism she gave you was the same expression you'd expect if you'd told her about unicorns or dragons that breathe rainbows. These children have developed what you can only describe as an apocalypse, adjusted normal, while you and the other adults walk around in a constant state of barely suppressed panic about the wrongness of everything. The kids have adapted to living in a world where breathing hurts, where food comes in tiny portions, and where people disappear regularly and permanently. They've normalized catastrophe in ways that would make a disaster psychologist either fascinated or deeply disturbed. The games children play have evolved to reflect their new reality in ways that would break your heart if you had any emotional energy left for heartbreak. Instead of playing house, they play rationing, carefully dividing imaginary food into smaller and smaller portions. Their version of hide and seek involves finding places to hide food supplies rather than hiding themselves. Tag has become a game about catching rats for dinner, which is both practical skill development and deeply depressing entertainment. You've watched children develop survival skills that would impress hardened wilderness experts, except these children think their expertise is normal childhood behavior. 7-year-old Marcus can identify edible insects with the precision of an entomologist and has developed techniques for catching rats that would make professional pest control specialists take notes. But ask him to imagine a world where food comes from stores rather than desperate scavenging, and he looks at you like you're describing life on another planet. The language these children use has adapted to their reality in ways that linguists would find fascinating if they weren't too busy trying not to die. They've developed specific words for different types of hunger. The sharp pain of acute starvation versus the dull ache of chronic malnutrition. They have detailed vocabulary for describing various stages of decay in preserved foods. And they can discuss the relative nutritional value of different types of tree bark with the casual expertise of professional nutritionists. Most disturbing is how they've learned to be emotionally efficient about death. When adults die, these children don't waste time on prolonged grieving. They immediately shift into practical mode, asking questions like, who gets their blanket? And Did they hide any food we should know about? It's not that they're callous. They've just learned that extended emotional processing is a luxury they can't afford when survival requires constant vigilance. Their concept of family has expanded beyond traditional bloodlines to include anyone who shares resources and provides protection. Little Emma calls you uncle, even though you're not related, because you've shared your food with her 3 times in the past month. These children have created chosen families based on survival alliances rather than genetic connections, forming bonds that are simultaneously deeper and more practical than traditional kinship. The educational system that once prepared children for adult life has been replaced by something that would make survival schools jealous. Instead of learning to read and write, children learn to identify the warning signs of plague, the best techniques for preserving meat, and how to determine whether water is safe to drink. They can calculate food rations in their heads with mathematical precision. But many of them have never seen written numbers. What would really blow your mind if you could see the global picture is that this exact phenomenon is happening simultaneously across the entire world. In China, children are growing up thinking that eating grass soup is normal cuisine. In the Byzantine Empire, kids are developing expertise in urban scavenging that would make post-apocalyptic survivors proud. Across the planet, an entire generation is being raised with the assumption that catastrophe is the natural state of existence. These children have developed a relationship with hope that's both heartbreaking and remarkably mature. They don't hope for things to go back to normal because they have no concept of what normal was supposed to be. Instead, they hope for small, immediate improvements. An extra handful of grain, a warmer place to sleep, making it through another day without losing anyone else they care about. Their optimism is calibrated to a reality that would crush most adults. The stories they tell each other at night aren't fairy tales about princesses and happy endings. They're practical narratives about clever children who outwit dangers and find hidden food caches. Their version of Once Upon a Time stories involve heroes who successfully navigate plague outbreaks and characters who discover new sources of nutrition in seemingly barren landscapes. It's folklore adapted for survival rather than entertainment. Perhaps most poignantly, these children have created their own traditions and celebrations that reflect their harsh reality. They celebrate Found Food Day. When someone discovers an unexpected food source, they mark No Death Day, when an entire week passes without losing anyone from their group. These aren't morbid observances. They're genuine expressions of joy adapted to circumstances where traditional celebrations would be meaningless. The physical development of these children tells a story that would make pediatricians weep. Chronic malnutrition has stunted their growth in ways that will affect them for their entire lives, assuming they have entire lives ahead of them. But they've also developed physical capabilities that children in normal times never need. Enhanced night vision from living in perpetual dimness, increased sensitivity to subtle changes in food quality, and stamina for physical hardship that would shame most adults. What's most remarkable is their resilience. Though calling it resilience almost seems insulting to the magnitude of what they're enduring. These children aren't bouncing back from adversity. They're growing up inside adversity, developing psychological and emotional frameworks that treat catastrophe as baseline reality. They're not recovering from trauma. They're building their entire identity around successfully navigating ongoing disaster. The adults who survive this catastrophe will spend years trying to readjust to normal life, haunted by memories of what they've done and witnessed. But these children won't be readjusting. They'll be learning for the first time what normal life even means. When this disaster finally ends, they'll be immigrants to a world of plenty that they've never experienced. And perhaps most sobering of all, these disaster-adapted children are going to be the adults who rebuild human civilization once this catastrophe finally ends. 14 months into your personal crash course in things that can go wrong with planets, you're about to order something that would simultaneously fascinate and absolutely horrify you if you had access to modern scientific understanding. The cosmic joke that has been systematically destroying your world isn't random bad luck or divine punishment. It's the result of a geological event so massive that it makes every natural disaster in recorded history look like a minor inconvenience. Picture this somewhere in what will eventually be called Indonesia, a volcano that had been quietly minding its own business for centuries suddenly decided to have the geological equivalent of a complete nervous breakdown. But this wasn't your garden variety volcanic eruption, the kind that destroys a local village and makes for dramatic paintings. This was a volcanic explosivity index 7 event, which is science's polite way of saying, holy shit. The mountain just exploded with the force of several thousand nuclear weapons. The Krakatoa eruption that will traumatize the 19th century and inspire countless disaster movies. That was a VI-6. Mount Vesuvius burying Pompeii, VI-5. This Indonesian monster was a full category above anything in recorded human history, releasing the equivalent energy of about 200 million tons of TNT all at once. To put that in perspective, the atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was 15,000 tons of TNT. So imagine about 13,000 Hiroshima bombs going off simultaneously, except instead of destroying a city, they're designed specifically to attack the planet's atmosphere. The explosion launched approximately 100 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, which is like injecting the entire planet's air supply with a cocktail designed by someone who really hates the concept of breathable atmosphere. This sulfur dioxide didn't just sit there being antisocial. It immediately got to work combining with water vapor to create sulfuric acid droplets that formed a global atmospheric haze. Essentially, the entire planet's sky became a weak acid bath that blocked out the sun while simultaneously trying to dissolve anything it came into contact with. But here's where the science gets really fun in that special way that makes you question whether the universe has a particularly dark sense of humor. The stratospheric injection wasn't just a one-time event. It created a self-perpetuating atmospheric nightmare that kept getting worse over time. The sulfuric acid droplets acted like tiny atmospheric mirrors, reflecting sunlight back into space while trapping heat close to the Earth's surface. It's like someone installed the world's most dysfunctional climate control system, one that simultaneously freezes and poisons everything it touches. The global temperature drop you've been experiencing wasn't just a minor climate hiccup. It was a 2-3 degrees Celsius decrease in average global temperature, which might not sound like much until you realize that the difference between our current climate and the last ice age was only about 6 degrees. You've been living through approximately half an ice age, compressed into the span of a single year. It's like Mother Nature decided to give the entire planet a preview of what the next glacial period might look like. Just for fun, the atmospheric chemistry experiment you've been unwillingly participating in has created a global environment that's toxic in ways that would make a chemical weapons designer nod in professional appreciation. Every breath you take contains sulfur compounds that your lungs weren't designed to process. Does it rain? that's been falling isn't just mildly acidic water. It's precipitation with a pH level that could probably clean the rust off medieval tools, assuming it doesn't dissolve the tools entirely first. What would really blow your mind is the global scale of this disaster. While you've been focused on your own village's struggle for survival, identical scenes have been playing out simultaneously across every inhabited continent on Earth. The volcanic winter has created crop failures from England to China, triggered famines from Scandinavia to sub-Saharan Africa, and enabled plague outbreaks across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. You're not experiencing a local disaster. You're living through a global catastrophe that's affecting every human being on the planet simultaneously. The Justinian plague that's been systematically destroying your community isn't just an unfortunate coincidence that happened to occur during the climate disaster. It's a direct consequence of the environmental chaos. The same climate disruption that's killing your crops has also disrupted animal migration patterns, forced disease, carrying rodents into closer contact with human populations, and weakened human immune systems to the point where diseases that might normally be manageable become civilization-ending pandemics. Modern scientists would tell you that you're witnessing the collision of multiple catastrophic feedback loops that have created what's essentially a perfect storm for civilizational collapse. Climate disaster leads to agricultural failure, which leads to malnutrition, which leads to increased disease susceptibility, which leads to population collapse, which leads to social breakdown, which makes recovery from the original climate disaster nearly impossible. It's like watching dominoes fall, except the dominoes are entire aspects of human civilization, and they're all connected in ways that make the collapse self-accelerating. The really mind-bending part is that this volcanic eruption occurred over 6,000 miles away from your village. Yet it's had more impact on your daily life than anything that's ever happened in your immediate vicinity. A mountain you've never heard of in a place you couldn't locate on a map, even if maps existed and you could read them, has fundamentally altered the trajectory of your entire civilization. It's like being killed by a butterfly effect, except the butterfly was a geological event that exploded with the force of a small asteroid impact. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the science behind your current nightmare is the realization that this type of event isn't particularly rare on geological timescales. Volcanic eruptions of this magnitude happen approximately once every few hundred to few thousand years, which means human civilization has been living on borrowed time since the day we started building permanent settlements. You're not experiencing a freak occurrence. You're getting a preview of the kind of natural disaster that periodically resets human progress back to zero. The atmospheric effects you've been enduring will persist for approximately 18 months total, but the cascading consequences of this single volcanic event will echo through human history for centuries. The population losses, the technological knowledge that's being lost, the social structures that are collapsing, these will take generations to rebuild, assuming they ever get rebuilt at all. What's happening to you right now is essentially a dress rehearsal for the end of the world, except it's not actually the end of the world. It's just the end of the world as anyone alive has ever known it. The planet will recover eventually, the climate will restabilize, and life will go on. But the human civilization that emerges from this catastrophe will be fundamentally different from the one that existed before that Indonesian mountain decided to explode. You're living through what scientists will eventually recognize as one of the most significant civilizational bottlenecks in human history, A disaster so comprehensive that it will literally reshape the genetic, cultural, and technological trajectory of our entire species. And the most terrifying part, this is just what volcanoes can do when they're having a bad day. 18 months. That's how long this atmospheric nightmare lasted before the skies finally began to clear and the sun started remembering how to do its job properly. 18 months of what you now recognize as humanity's closest brush with complete civilizational extinction. A disaster so comprehensive that if it had lasted just a few years longer. You might not be here to tell this story, and neither would anyone else. But here's the thing that would keep you awake at night. If you fully understood it, those 18 months weren't just a random duration that the universe decided to inflict on humanity. They represent the absolute outer limit of what human civilization could endure before crossing the point of no return, if the volcanic winter had persisted for another year or two. You wouldn't be looking back on this as the worst year in human history. You'd be looking back on it as the year human history ended. The mathematics of civilizational collapse are surprisingly precise, though no one in your time has the luxury of understanding them. Modern scientists would tell you that complex societies can survive approximately 36 months of severe resource disruption before they reach what's called a complexity collapse threshold. Beyond that point, the interconnected systems that make civilization possible don't just fail. They fail so completely that rebuilding them becomes impossible with the remaining population and resources. Your community, which started this disaster with roughly 200 people, now has maybe 30 survivors. That's an 85% population loss, which puts you right at the edge of what demographers call social viability threshold. The minimum number of people needed to maintain the basic functions of a community. Drop below that threshold, and you don't have a struggling village anymore. You have a small band of individuals who lack the collective knowledge and manpower to maintain even the most basic aspects of civilized life. If the disaster had continued for another year, your remaining 30 survivors would have become 10, then 5, then maybe 2 or 3 individuals who possessed fragments of knowledge but lacked the social structure to pass it on effectively. The blacksmithing skills, the agricultural techniques, the basic crafts that keep human civilization functioning, all of it would have died with the last person who remembered how to do it properly. Multiply that scenario across every community on Earth, and you start to understand just how close our species came to what scientists call a technological bottleneck collapse. Not extinction. Humans are remarkably hard to kill entirely, but a civilizational reset so severe that the survivors would have been forced to reinvent everything from scratch. We're talking about a global reversion to hunter-gatherer societies, except starting from a position where most of the easily accessible resources had already been depleted by previous civilizations. The global population, which historians estimate was around 250 million people before 536 AD, dropped by approximately 25–50% during this period. That's somewhere between 125 million human beings who simply ceased to exist. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to wiping out the entire population of modern-day Mexico or making every single person in Japan and South Korea disappear. Except this happened across the entire planet simultaneously, creating demographic gaps that took centuries to recover from. But population loss was just the beginning of how close we came to permanent civilizational collapse. The real danger was knowledge extinction, the systematic disappearance of accumulated human expertise that had taken centuries to develop. Each dead craftsperson, each extinct family line, each abandoned settlement represented not just individual tragedy, but the irreversible loss of techniques, traditions, and understanding that had been passed down through generations. If you could see a global map of technological and social infrastructure during this period, it would look like watching the lights go out across an entire continent. Rome, once the administrative heart of the Western world, saw its population drop from over 1 million to perhaps 50,000. Constantinople, the jewel of the Eastern Empire, lost half its inhabitants. In China, entire regions simply stopped appearing in historical records because there was no one left to keep records and no administrative structure capable of maintaining them. The most terrifying aspect of how close we came to the end wasn't the dramatic deaths from plague and starvation. Those, at least, were visible and immediate. The real existential threat was the quiet disappearance of complexity itself. Trade networks that had connected distant continents simply vanished when there weren't enough merchants left to maintain them. Educational systems collapsed when there weren't enough students to justify teachers. Legal systems evaporated when there weren't enough people to require governance. Modern complexity theorists would tell you that civilizations don't usually collapse suddenly. They undergo what's called complexity cascades, where the failure of one interconnected system triggers the failure of others in an accelerating spiral. What happened in 536 AD was the closest thing to a global complexity cascade that human civilization has ever experienced and survived. If it had continued for just a bit longer, the cascade would have become irreversible. Perhaps the most sobering realization is that this near-extinction event was caused by a single geological event that humanity had absolutely no control over and no ability to predict or prevent. A volcano most people had never heard of, in a place most people couldn't locate, had the power to nearly end human civilization entirely. It's like discovering that your entire species' survival depends on the geological mood swings of mountains you'll never see. The recovery process that you're now witnessing, the gradual return of adequate sunlight, the slow improvement in agricultural yields, the cautious rebuilding of social structures, represents one of the most remarkable comeback stories in human history. But it's also a recovery that was only possible because the disaster stopped when it did. Had the volcanic winter persisted into a third year, you would have crossed the threshold from catastrophic but recoverable to civilization ending. What makes this particularly mind-bending is that the difference between human civilization continuing and human civilization ending came down to essentially random geological timing. If that Indonesian volcano had been a bit larger, or if a second major eruption had occurred while the atmosphere was still compromised, or if the climate system had responded just slightly differently to the initial disruption, you wouldn't be here having thoughts about recovery. Because there wouldn't be enough surviving humans to constitute a civilization worth recovering. The children who grew up during this disaster, those apocalypse adapted survivors we talked about earlier, are going to spend their adult lives rebuilding a world that came within months of disappearing entirely. They'll be the generation tasked with reconstructing the accumulated knowledge and social complexity that nearly died with their parents. In many ways, they're not just rebuilding civilization. They're rebuilding it from the closest brush with extinction that our species has ever experienced. Looking around at your slowly recovering community, at the returning green in the fields, at the neighbors who somehow survived when so many others didn't, you're witnessing something that future historians will recognize as one of the most improbable survival stories in human history. Not just your personal survival, but the survival of the entire project of human civilization itself. You lived through humanity's closest call with the end of everything, and somehow, through luck, determination, and the arbitrary timing of geological events, we all made it to the other side. But just barely. So here we are 15 centuries later, living in a world that almost never existed. Every time you flip a light switch and illuminate a room, every time you walk into a grocery store filled with abundant food, every time you check the weather forecast on your phone and complain about a cloudy day, you're experiencing luxuries that the survivors of 536 AD could never have imagined. But more than that, you're living proof that human civilization is both impossibly fragile and remarkably resilient. The year 536 teaches us something uncomfortable about our place in the universe. We're not the masters of our destiny that we like to imagine. A single geological event, happening thousands of miles away from most human settlements, nearly ended our entire civilizational project. All our accumulated knowledge, all our social structures, all our technological achievements, they hung by a thread so thin that 18 months of bad weather almost cut it entirely. Yet here's what's remarkable: we survived. Not just as individuals, but as a species capable of learning, growing, and building something better than what came before. The children who grew up eating tree bark and breathing poison air went on to become the adults who rebuilt the world. They carried forward not just the trauma of near extinction, but the profound knowledge of what human beings are capable of enduring and overcoming. Today, when we face our own global challenges, climate change, pandemics, social upheaval, it's worth remembering that we come from people who literally survived the worst year in human history. We carry in our DNA, in our cultural memory, in our collective human spirit, the resilience of those who looked into the abyss of civilizational collapse and refused to fall in. The next time you find yourself worried about the future, remember the survivors of 536 AD. They didn't know if the sun would ever shine properly again, if crops would ever grow normally, if their children would live to adulthood. But they got up each morning anyway, did what needed to be done, and somehow managed to pass down to us the gift of a functioning world. Maybe that's the most important lesson from humanity's worst year. We're stronger than we know, and the future is worth fighting for, even when we can't see it clearly through the darkness. Wow, we made it through together. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the darkest chapters in human history. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Until next time, take care of each other, and maybe take a moment to appreciate that the sun is shining and the grocery stores are full.